Good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's presentation on the intersection of trade and supply chain strategy. My name is Joe Adamski. I'm a managing director with Procurability. With me today is Pierre Mitchell, Chief Research Officer of Spend Matters, a Hackett Group division. And Pierre is joining us from Cape Cod, which just went through the blizzard that moved through the Northeast. So if we have any IT hiccups, we will deal with that as we move along. That's the reality sometimes these days of our existence. I also want to thank the Supreme Court for issuing a decision on Friday that made this discussion incredibly timely. So for the last year, tariffs have reshaped global supply chains, and that really has become our new normal. Last week's Supreme Court decision resets that to a degree, but as one of the justices noted, it really just delays the imposition of tariffs. It doesn't stop them. This shift has created a strategic inflection point where companies need to readjust their supply chains in response and hedge against future questions or future activities, right? So, Pierre, we've watched trade policy swing back and forth for years. What feels fundamentally different about it now?
Well, it's good to get off the topic of AI, and that's fundamentally different. And that certainly has an impact in supply chains around CapEx, right? And things like that. And the K-shaped, CapEx investments. And obviously, there's a lot of big supply chains in there, and tariffs do affect that. But let's just talk, more broadly. I think what's kind of fundamentally different is that companies have finally kind of woken up to the fact that tariffs and other supply chain risks are just going to be an ongoing thing. It's kind of like a heart attack or something, or heart problems where you have normal heartbeat, and occasionally, you have little hiccups, with the tariffs, but now it's just like fibrillation constantly happening, right? So we need to have, an EKG to monitor what's happening, make sure we have all the intelligence to make these decisions, but also have those paddles at the ready to, to deal with what's happening. And so, obviously we have to operate in this VUCA world, and certainly in terms of, dealing with tariffs and, the whack-a-mole and how we just deal with the tariff du jour and that's not going to change with, Section 301 and all the investigations that'll be happening by company. And I'll let you get into some of that, but, certainly there's a lot of activity right now that is happening just based on, the latest changes to the regs. So maybe I'll turn it back, over to you, Joe, in terms of just like some of the things that you're seeing around as companies are dealing with, how do we just deal with the short-term negotiations and the levers that we pull, what we pass on to customers or not. Maybe just give a little day in the life about what you're doing with companies beyond, negotiating to get a DDP, term conversion on your next contract.
Yeah. So the immediate impact that I think most of my clients faced was two questions that need to be addressed. One was the immediate, who's going to pay the tariff? And that largely came down to a question around Incoterms and holding the suppliers to their feet to the fire on it. Hey, if you agreed to DDP, you have to pay the tariff. The follow-on question, though, is who ultimately pays the tariff? Because this was a significant price increase that had not been anticipated. If you look back over the last year, we saw 40, 50, 100, 150% tariffs being imposed. That cost was not something that any of the suppliers were going to be able to absorb into their margins. It was not something that was ever anticipated when they agreed contractually to the prices that they did. So that was ultimately going to have to get passed along in some form or fashion. Now, companies initially looked at that to say, can we do some sort of a cost sharing model? I think that was an anticipation that this was going to be a short-term thing. As we've seen now, that has become more of a structural change. That now has shifted quite a bit. In fact, a recent study from the New York Fed showed that 90% of the cost of the tariffs is being absorbed by U.S. companies. And in fact, 70% of that's being passed along to the U.S. consumer. And that constitutes a $1,000 to $1,200 tax increase on every American household to correspond to the cost of the tariffs. And studies show that only about 5% of that is being borne by the suppliers themselves, the foreign suppliers. And even last night at the State of the Union, the president still insisted that these are being paid by foreign companies, but that's just not the lived experience of the American consumer. So the way that companies had responded with that is exactly what we said. Is one, let's firefight, let's figure out the immediate issue. Let's understand how do we get our stuff out of the customs yard so that we can continue to do the things that we need to. Longer term now, how do we start to adjust our contracts? How do we work with our vendors in order to be able to understand what is this going to do from a long-term price perspective? And long term, as they looked at it, said, well, this is our new normal. It gets passed along and it just flows into the supply chain further downstream. Every step of that supply chain now starts absorbing pieces of it.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. I think one of the things that's really interesting when you talked about just the conversation of what do we pass on to customers, you immediately kind of expand the aperture around, with procurement and really strategic supply management, beyond just the supply side and supply availability, and even just kind of total landed cost, cost to serve. But you start getting into total impacted, value. And I mean, if you go back to the old 2x2, the Crowley's, value and complexity, it's not, value isn't just spend, right? It's going to be total value at risk. And that's a conversation that is something that is at the board level, cross functionally. It's something that involves the CFO and the head of product and supply chain and marketing. And it gets into these issues around design and product management. And I mean, that is the opportunity side, right? Especially for procurement, to not just be like, here's our spend, let's map it to some HTS goes, here's the impacted tariff, potential impacted tariffs. Obviously you need that, right? But then being able to say, okay, well, what is going to be now this total value at risk, and doing it in a broader lens that's not just the tariff discussion, but it's all these other associated risks and trade-offs, right? Like you're kind of talking about. So that seems to be it is a good opportunity. And it seems like companies are at least incrementally building out those capabilities for whether you want to call them control towers or, more sophisticated data analytics that shift from just the spend side to a broader, value kind of modeling side. So I don't know if you have any.
Well, that is the fundamental shift. It's moving and looking at that end-to-end value chain, because there are things that procurement can do. And that's going to be switching suppliers. It's going to be trying to beat up suppliers around price. It's trying to get the right Incoterms put in place. They can do all of those things. But when you start looking at it from a value chain perspective, it's say, okay, what can we do different fundamentally as a company to be able to address this? Can we redesign our products? Are we using things that are foreign content that we can do this in a different way to where we just don't need that component? There may be a domestic source for it. It's immaterial. It's just looking at it from a standpoint of, do we actually need this when we start looking at our products? You can look at nearshoring. You can look at revamping your supply mix to be able to spread the risk around if it's any one particular supplier. You can look at different geographic sourcing for those, which is largely things procurement's already doing. But it's also one of those of looking at what can we do even further from there? Do we need to look at this as something that we've got to think about from a core competency perspective or a partnership perspective? Do we need to develop the capability to produce some of these things on our own? Or do we need to look at developing suppliers in a different part of the world? Could be near shore, could be onshore, could be just in a different offshore geography. You want to have all of those degrees of freedom available and open, and at least talk through those things to understand what your potential menu of responses are. And you may be limited at the end of the day, but that first discussion needs to be unconstrained.
Yeah, it's so funny. The thing that's like popping into my head is around this whole area around just like sourcing optimization, right? Which is just the idea that we want to just open up the aperture to understand what supply markets can actually do, but also open up demand and understand around demand planning, and then feed that into scenario planning, and really being able to look at the much bigger picture. So we can look at product strategy, we can look at unbundling and rebundling. And the product side, I mean, not to quote George Costanza, but there's definitely some shrinkage going on in like the products that I'm buying, the consumer products. So there's a lot of that value engineering work, right? That's happening. So I think that ability to kind of to really truly model what does value mean, and then what does, as you break that down to total cost models and volumes, and taking that to a broader kind of supply network model and these things to really, kind of unpack some of this stuff to open up these levers and make these things visible, right? That is where, supply organizations really have a chance to shine, to elevate the value of supply from just supply assurance, right? And even just total cost to a much broader thing. So I know you do a lot of work with clients around like scenario planning. And I mean, it's one of those things like, how do you sell the value of scenario planning and resilience and these more sophisticated things? But the companies that do it sure are reaping some of the benefits. But I don't know, maybe you can opine a little bit on that.
Yeah, I think that's something that some companies do well and some don't. And what it fundamentally is it's looking at the potential futures and starting to map those out and say, what there are certain things that will change. We may end up in a certain future. If we're there, what does that mean for us? What are the potential benefits? What are the potential risks? What mitigations do we need to put in place? And if we're in that future, what does that mean for us holistically from a supply chain perspective, from an operational perspective of what are we doing and what do we need to do different? But you need to have multiples of those. And within that too, you also have to have the sensitivity analysis around it of, if my assumptions are wrong, how much does that change?
Right.
Because some of them can be very sensitive to input conditions and some may not be. But that is something fundamentally that companies need to put in place. And it's not a procurement thing. It is, procurement has a piece of that. In fact, one of the things when I go into an organization that I look at to understand how mature the procurement organization is to see how early in the process and how broadly across the company is procurement involved. If procurement's just brought in at the tail end, we're told, hey, we've already picked our supplier, go negotiate the terms and conditions. Great, that's not a very mature organization. Yeah. If they're sitting in the demand planning, the S&OP planning discussions, they're talking with the sales team so they understand what's coming down the line, that's a mature organization. And that's a strategic part of the company. And they're seen as a strategic asset with that.
Yeah. So, more levers, right? More levers to pull. And actually, I can tell you that from, being at the Hackett Group with benchmarking, all that, the number one most predictive best practice in procurement around driving more value is the level of earliness of procurement involvement at the time of strategy, planning, and budgeting. And obviously you need to add value, right? When you're in that process. And certainly that means bringing supply intelligence, being able to run, to be able to really add to the conversation about potential risks, but also opportunities, and then work with the rest of the businesses, to say, okay, well, what does that mean? And what are kind of our options around scenarios and things like that? And that scenario planning is not just within the sourcing box for leading up to a sourcing event, but it's a much bigger discussion around how do we just run a resilient, business, right? So, that scenario planning is pretty important. I can't remember. We had a polling question, didn't we, on scenario planning? I don't know if we have the time to do it, or
I think we do. Yeah. And so I'll throw that out there for our listeners out there in LinkedIn land. Does your company do this today? Do you have a formal, broadly scenario planning, but maybe it's focused on tariffs, but do you have a scenario planning model in place? And how would you describe it if you do? Certainly take a few seconds, please put it into the chat, and we'll review some of the answers that we get. And while that's happening, I'll say structurally, when we think about it, we said it needs to be cross-functional. Procurement has that seat. So does risk. So does regulatory. So does sales, operations. All of these voices need to be heard to get the various components, because different perspectives are going to bring different information about what in that world, in that future that we're talking about, what are the potential risks? What are the benefits? What can we do to mitigate around those things? If it's procurement sitting in a room talking to themselves, it's going to fail. Yeah,
no, it's great. I'll be curious what everybody says here on the poll. But anyway, so I guess while you're kind of just reviewing those, to comment on that. I mean, I think that the one area that is really interesting for me that I've spent a lot of time in is kind of looking at that area around supply chain risk, and how do we model that, and and it's like anything, right? In terms of, it's only going to be your capability is only going to be as good as kind of the models that you build. And I think, like you had talked, in a previous discussion when I had chatted with you around kind of efficiency, right, versus kind of this resilience. And we designed really great supply chains to be highly efficient with just in time, but they were built under this planning assumption that the world was going to go according to what we thought. And so it was very fragile, right? It was not really built for resiliency. And I
Right.
think around this, the domain around supply chain risk modeling is an important one to just master and tie that in with, category strategy, with spend analytics, with, just the other tendrils, right, that you want to hook up,
Mhm.
to the rest of the business. And it's just valuable because that way it forces you to define value. It forces you to value risk. It forces you to define all the risk elements. And are those actually all the risks that are going to hurt you versus not? Like, as humans, we have blind spots, right? And if we're focusing in whack-a-mole just on the tariff du jour, and we're totally forgetting about this other risk around China and, rare earth metals, or they're going to go in and take TSMC, or, whatever the scenario is, making sure that those models are broad and that they're also deep and they're also active and constantly kind of curated so that you can feel comfortable that you're getting the signals that you want. And then you can kind of inform these scenarios and make sure that you can sleep at night, that there's not going to be any black, at least gray swans that come out of the woodwork.
Sure. But I think that's also important, though, from a terminology perspective, to be clear. When we're talking about efficiency and resiliency, that is the tension in supply chain design. If you're looking for an efficient supply chain, that's exactly as described. You are trying to drive every penny out of that possible. You have the minimum amount of inventory at the lowest price you can possibly buy it, sourcing from wherever in the world that you can get it. From an operational perspective, as you're pulling that last item off the shelf to bring it over to the line, the truck is pulling up to the bay with the next pallet of that particular item ready to get offloaded and put in storage. That's an efficient supply chain. We, during COVID, or run up to COVID, collectively, globally, over-indexed on efficiency. And the black swan that was the pandemic blew up supply chains, and it's taken us years to climb out of the hole that created. The flip side of that is resiliency. And so that is designing your supply chain to be able to absorb shocks. Looking at it from a standpoint of, well, I have known shocks that I can carry additional safety stock for, but now how much unknown shocks do I need to try to account for? And that's important to be able to do so that you can navigate, because we don't know what the future is necessarily going to hold. A fuzzy crystal ball can only show me so much. But if you're carrying 4 times the inventory that your models tell you that you should, that's not a good answer either, in terms of what is locking up from a working capital perspective, just from a cost perspective, an operational perspective. Storage. I've seen clients where they just did not have enough warehouse storage. And so things that are relatively high value items are sitting out in the yard exposed to the elements because they can't move them into the warehouse. That's not a good answer when you ultimately get that, because you've over indexed on the resiliency side. And that happens, though, because people react out of fear. And that's certainly seeing some of that in the tariff world that we're in now, of saying, well, let me just get the inventory so I know that I have it. Well, that's great, but you're not going to use it. And that creates issues with slob. It creates issues with disposal, all of that you start to run into. And so your supply chains can break down just from the amount of weight that you put into them.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I mean, I'll just build on it. I think the whole area around efficiency, obviously there's the supply chain efficiency, but as you design supply chains, the efficiency of your supply chain and procurement and business staff, and they have very limited bandwidth to this ability to manage this massive complexity, is a pretty big deal. If you're spending all your time, firefighting and data wrangling and doing all this low value stuff, and then you're not going to be thinking about what that next risk is going to be. You're always going to be on your heels. And that's where data and analytics is really important, so that you have these models, right? So that you can actually be able to then to use them. And guess what? Automation and, yes, AI and agentic AI can be very useful in workflows and data pipelines and things like this to reduce the human investment that's required to manage this infrastructure. So, as I always say, the highest cost in procurement is the opportunity cost of your time wasted on low value stuff, when efficiency should actually fund effectiveness in terms of freeing you up to run broader models, deeper models, more active, engaging with the business. And in doing that, showing your value and, beyond just kind of the tariff, driver, but also being able to look at, much a broader set of risks and a broader set of opportunities. So,
Mhm.
had to drop in AI somewhere in this conversation on the agentic side. And it is important. Let's not forget that those little agents need some context. And that context is a knowledge model and a data model and an analytic model and a decision model to do these things. And if you're not actively building that, then you're just never going to get there, because you're just going to constantly be reacting because you are not efficient enough in terms of
Right.
how you manage the function.
So we've had a couple of the comments come in that I think are worthwhile to address. One talked about being in medical product supply. Well, that introduces a whole new wrinkle because of the regulatory environment that those have to operate in. Talking about life-saving equipment,
Yeah.
you've got a whole different set of rules. The degrees of freedom are very different. So yeah, that's going to limit some of your opportunities to do things. So that has to be addressed. And second, Faraz brought up a good point about how do you restructure some of your supplies, and there's some of your suppliers, and this is something that you can plan for as we look at that, some of those future scenarios. And the way I think about it from your supply base, it's ever you got a sole source, you can do a champion challenger model, you can look at a multi-source model. You need to balance those, because as you move down that, you disaggregate your volume, which increases your cost because you're not going to get the best price possible for it. But you're moving your risk out by having multiple suppliers available to you, and they can be in different geographies. So you may have one in Southeast Asia, one in Central America, one in Europe, and you move your orders around based on what that particular landscape looks like at that particular moment.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's a really good point too, around really thinking strategically about supply. And, a lot of times what you're trying to do is going to involve multiple categories, right? As you're thinking about, all right, do I go into a certain CapEx project, or do I go into a certain business initiative? And that's going to be a whole portfolio of separate categories. And, and you need to be able to look at those things together, and also to kind of deconstruct this. And yeah, I mean, there's always going to be those constraints whenever you're optimizing something. There's going to be the scenario planning, and then there's going to be the constraints that you have in that, and that ability to just model that. And here's where you can use, again, analytics, more sophisticated analytics to help with that, is going to put you in a better position, because it just gives you more kind of strategic options that you can kind of look at. I mean, if you think about like the whole ESG world, and we're like, oh, okay, we need to, do some stuff with renewables. And then you start getting into, what's that going to mean in terms of our capability? Well, now we're going to start, like you saw this in medical and in pharma. Well,
Mhm.
now we're actually looking at, banding together and then working to create joint, energy agreements, and building, leveraging the building of power plants that use renewables, so that we can get some of those credits, but also create more kind of, vertically available energy. And guess what? The supply chain around energy is pretty hungry right now to feed all the AI, demands on it. So, that ability to think more broadly around the network and cross category and doing these things is something where you have to build towards that capability if you're actually going to be able to give the business options around trading off, this kind of, resilience versus efficiency, like you were saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that builds into what companies need to do. I'll say it's a prime example, looking at some of these alternatives. So negotiating power purchase agreements. I've worked with some of my clients, help them get through that particular problem, looking at a standpoint of, can they, it's a simple answer if you put solar panels on top of your building, or
Right.
do you do a purchase agreement with someone that's an offsite location for some other form of renewable, maybe it's a solar farm, but some bit of renewable energy, and you're able to lock that up for yourself. As we're seeing evolutions in terms of data centers that are coming online, and as power hungry and water hungry, different resource that you have to address, as those are, that's going to shift the dynamics, because there's frankly not enough generation capacity in the US right now to meet the demands of what we're seeing. You have companies like Meta that are planning to build their own power plants and run their own power plants. Totally not a core competency. But in order to be able to lock up that supply of that energy that they will need to be able to run their particular facility, that's their solution for it. But I think that leads into what companies need to be doing in the interim. If they're not already going through and doing some of this scenario planning and understanding their risk exposure and the value engineering, you're well behind at this point. And those companies need to start doing that. They need to look at it to understand what is their exposure by category and by commodity. Understanding what is your supply base within those. Where does this stuff come from? What are your tier 2 suppliers looking like? Where are your tier 3 suppliers? Because you may have risk exposures there that you're just not even anticipating. And that may not even be tariff related, to be honest. If we look at some of the things like the Uyghur labor camps,
yep.
I've known clients that have gotten a shock when they found out that it was somewhere far down in their supply chain, they had an exposure. And, if you're a US based company, you have to fix that. That's illegal. You cannot operate that way.
Right. I think about those 301 investigations, right? This is a perfect place to latch onto that, because if you're going to go in and do an investigation into a country about unfair practices or, practices that aren't supporting, basic fair trade and things like that, that's a pretty nice hammer. And you get our government and the business behind really driving some of these things versus, oh, here's another ESG reg du jour that you need to support, albeit well-intentioned. But now when you're getting into, the tariff driven, like the 301 investigations that have a lot of these things that can be tucked in there, that's a nice way. I mean, that's a potential way, right, to kind of, tie into something that's already happening. So sorry, I took you off here.
No, absolutely. But I mean, that creates an immediacy to it because there's a clock with those. When the 301 investigation is announced,
right.
by regulation, by statutory requirement, it has to be completed within 270 days. So when that announcement comes that they've opened the investigation, which is public information, you have a brief period of time to figure out, based on the potential outcomes of the investigation that you anticipate. And you're not necessarily going to have that completely correct, but you can look at it and say, well, if there's A, B, C in terms of the degree of change that we're taking a look at, you have to model that out and understand what can you do ahead of that? What should you do ahead of it? And are there changes that you can implement now that will address any of the potential risks that are coming under each of those scenarios? Put that in place and then understand what are the triggers that you're looking for to give you the idea of what does that future, how do we know that we're in that particular future? And then you can use AI, you can't avoid it, to be able to help monitor some of those things, because there will be signals that are coming from somewhere buried deep in the supply chain that you're not necessarily going to see. But if you have the right agent set up looking for the right information, you can get a trigger on that faster than some of your competitors are, so that you can start to react and position yourselves to be able to be in front of those things rather than reacting when the final announcement comes.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think that's a, good tactical advice. And I'm sure you guys have the 90-day plans to help companies kind of, get up to speed and, on this journey. So, I know we only just got like 2 minutes left. Are there any other questions, or just kind of, we can maybe, potentially ramp up on just kind of a couple of final thoughts? What do you think, Joe?
Well, I think we'll go ahead and wrap up on the final thoughts, unless a question happens to come in the interim, in which case I'll divert. But I just want to thank you for this conversation here today, Pierre. This has been a wonderful discussion. I think it's been very enlightening. I hope our audience learned something here, got something out of it. Certainly, if anyone needs to reach out to either of us, if we said something that triggers a question for you, we're both on LinkedIn. You can find us very easily. Again, Joe Adamski, Pierre Mitchell. But go ahead and take a look at those. But fundamentally, what we want to summarize, trade volatility has become structural, and your supply chains need to adjust to be able to address that. There are variables that are coming that we don't necessarily know the full impact of, but you can plan around those based on what the menu of potential options are. Organizations that model this well, that quantify, that look at risks, that look at the value that's within those and design intentionally, are going to outperform those that are just reactive. So that's the future that you need to plan for yourself and put yourself into. Invite everyone to join us for the next Procurability Live event, be on April 22nd, Earth Day. It's going to be discussed partnering across the value chain to deliver sustainability in an era of disruption. And it's going to be delivered in conjunction with SIPs. So please join us there. It'll be also broadcast on LinkedIn. So thank you all very much for your time today. We do appreciate it. And thank you, Pierre, for your time.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, everyone.